The stages of listening to Boise State Public Radio podcasts. Step 1, testing the waters. You tune into an episode or two. Nothing too serious. Step 2, you got a little hooked on one of those series like Extremely American or Scandalized, and now you're binging. No judgment, but you did listen to it in one day. Step 3, now you're subscribed to a feed. You get notifications to your phone every time there's a new daily episode of The Connector or Idaho Matters. I see where this is going. Step 4, you realize how much time you're spending with Boise State Public Radio podcasts and the fact that it doesn't cost you a dime. Step 5, you decide to step up and support your podcast listening because you can, because you want to, not because you have to. All right, now's the time, you podcast fan you. Go to boisestatepublicradio.org and click donate to support your love of Boise State Public Radio podcast listening today.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. The 2025 Idaho legislature officially kicks off Monday as lawmakers gather in the State House in Boise to set the budget for the new year and write the new laws that will impact our everyday lives. Now, there will be some fresh faces in the Capitol and some changes to leadership, all thanks to the November election, where Republicans tighten their hold on the legislature by taking over 3 seats that used to be held by Democrats. So to get an idea of what the session might look like this year, we asked our politics reporter, James Dawson, who is also the host of the Legislative Roundup newsletter, to join us once again for a preview. Hi, Jimmy.
Gemma, hello.
Happy New Year, right?
Yes, Happy New Year. That's the coffee in me talking.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll take it. Okay. So, Jimmy, let's talk a little bit before we get into what we can expect this session. What happened in November with the election and how that impacted the Idaho legislature?
Yeah, the election had a lot of consequences. Like you said, Republicans won back 3 seats from Democrats. Now they have an 86% majority across the entire state legislature, which is a massive number. It's not the highest in the country, but it sure is one of the highest. So what that practically means is budgets could be more at risk. We routinely see Democrats partnering with more traditional and moderate Republicans to kind of get those spending plans passed. I'm thinking specifically about higher education budget, Medicaid budget. It kind of seems like every year they pick out 1 or 2 different things that come out of nowhere that we never expected, like no concerns got brought up during committee hearings or during the JFAC process, but fail on the floor for some reason. So that routinely comes up, and those could be much more in jeopardy now. The other thing that we're seeing is with those 3 Democratic seat flips, fewer Democrats are being assigned to committees because of their dwindling numbers. So if you look at the House side, you have half of the 12 non-budget committees and 1/3 of the Senate committees losing a Democratic seat. So if you look at, which ones are most prominent, education and health and welfare in the House, as well as state affairs and health and welfare are notable in the Senate. So what that means is that Democrats will have fewer opportunities to block legislation that they think is harmful from reaching the floor, or advancing a bill that they think is great and needs to be heard by, the full Senate or the full House.
So, Jimmy, can we go back to what you said about committees and Democrats being on less committees? I mean, when you have less people, that means you're going to be stretched thinner. And I think you and I had a conversation a little bit earlier when you talked about really the amount of time it takes to be on one of these committees. So can you kind of explain that again to our listeners, that it's not necessarily they're being kicked off these committees, it's just that there's just not enough Democrats. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's part of the reason. When we spoke to House Speaker Mike Moyle a couple of years ago, when Democrats in the House lost, I think they lost 1 or 2 seats at that point. And so that's when Speaker Moyle took one of the two Democratic seats off of JFAC, the Joint Finance and Appropriations Budget Writing Committee. He chalked it up to, hey, Democrats, you lost, and therefore, proportionally, you have the same amount of representation as you do in the rest of the legislature. So I think, yes, part of it is simply that if you have fewer people in the Democratic caucus, it's harder to say, hey, pick up an extra committee assignment. You're going to have to spend another couple, 3 hours during these hearings per week, not to mention all of the background work that it takes to kind of buff yourself up on whatever issues are coming before the committee. So I think it's a mix of both, but certainly, at least Speaker Moyle has not been shy about saying elections have consequences.
So let's stick with committees for a minute, because in early December, the legislature was actually in Boise because one of the things they did was pick who will lead each committee this session. So what kind of changes, if any, Jimmy, did we see in regards to that?
We saw a few changes in the committee leadership makeup. That's mostly due to people being ousted in the primary. I would say the most talked about is probably Representative Doug Pickett taking over House Education from former Representative Julie Yamamoto. That was a really interesting choice if you're going to try to read those tea leaves, because Pickett wasn't even on the Education Committee over the last 2 years. Speaker Moyle passed over Representative Lori McCann, who was and still is vice chair. We don't exactly know the reason why, but something that's interesting is McCann has been skeptical of using public money to fund private education, whether it's through a school voucher, tax credit, you name whatever policy you'd like. She hasn't necessarily been in favor of that. If you look at Idaho Education News, our friends over there pointed out last month that Pickett did vote in favor of this failed tax credit. It would have spent $50 million to cover private school tuition. And that's something that Speaker Moyle has told us, kind of year in, year out, both at the beginning of each session and at the end, saying, I really, really want some kind of school choice thing to pass. And this seems, we don't know for sure, but sure seems like it's a step toward that.
So, Jimmy, my understanding is almost half of the members of the legislature's really powerful budget writing committee have changed this year. So I'm curious about how that could impact on what comes out of the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee, also known as JFAC.
I think it really comes down to how much homework each individual member wants to do. Like you mentioned, they're an extremely powerful committee. They're the ones who basically not even basically, they do set every single budget before it goes to the House or Senate for approval. The vast majority of those budgets, are passed with a few hiccups here and there. However, it's a huge time commitment. I mean, you're there every single day, every morning, at least by 8 a.m. when public hearings start. There's a massive learning curve. I mean, state budgets, it takes forever to kind of figure out just kind of a basic understanding of, what do these different funding streams mean? Where are they coming from? Occasionally, you'll even see some veteran JFAC members ask a question like, wait a second, what is this again? Oh, yeah. So it's going to be a learning curve. B, does that mean that they will maybe rely more on the governor's recommended spending plan, which we'll learn more about on Monday? Does it mean that they'll be more, likely to be swayed by lobbyists who want to get in, a pet project here and there? Or does it mean that they'll, refer to kind of the veterans on the committee who've been there for a while and just kind of take their word for it? It just basically means that, we've got this magic 8-ball where you shake it up and you don't know what's going to come out of it.
So, Jimmy, how did the November elections potentially impact JFAC and who sits on that committee in terms of Republicans and Democrats?
Yeah, like I said, there are a whole lot of new people in there and a lot of, people who are actually new to the legislature as well. So you have, let me just pull this up really quickly. I mean, you've got a bunch of members who are brand new to that committee. Some have been in the legislature before, some have not. You've got Senate Minority Leader Melissa Wintrow picking up her seat back on JFAC. So she's a Democrat from Boise. She's been on the committee before, but kind of took a break when she became a leader there. You've got several members of House Republican leadership there as well. It's just a whole lot of new faces that we don't necessarily know how they're going to vote on things like higher education or Medicaid necessarily, things of that nature.
So I want to talk next, Jimmy, about some of the top issues that we know lawmakers are thinking about this session. Can we start with abortion laws? Tell us what might be happening here, if anything.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where there's a lot of talk, certainly before the legislative session, at the beginning, during, and even toward the end. The last couple years, we just haven't seen any momentum or movement behind like a kind of a singular idea. You have a lot of Republican legislators who say that they want to kind of carve out more of an exception for, an abortion to save the health of the mother, which is currently not the case in Idaho. It's only when her life is threatened that an abortion could be performed legally anyway. But there's just a whole lot of, I guess, details that a lot of them differ on as to what constitutes the health of the mother. Does her mental health count as part of her overall health? Is it just physical health? Which specific conditions would be allowed to trigger a legal abortion? All of those things have been talked about probably ad nauseum behind the scenes for a long time with pro-life anti-abortion advocates, which are a big lobbying presence here in Idaho. I don't know if anything will actually get done, especially since the legislature kind of moved further to the right in the primary with more conservative lawmakers taking over for incumbents that lost.
Mm-hmm. So, Jimmy, what about IVF? Are lawmakers looking at this at all? Because again, since the fall of Roe v. Wade, because of the Dobbs decision 2 years ago, this has become a big issue in numerous states.
Right. It's something that has been discussed. I don't know what form it will take, or if it's going to, kind of meet that same fate as abortion talks, where it's just too much of a hot topic to consider. Like you mentioned last February, when the Alabama Supreme Court ruled embryos and IVF clinics were considered legal humans, several states shielded IVF from those types of potential laws or interpretations by the court. Idaho was working towards something, but things kind of fell apart toward the end of session after Democrats who were fed up on abortion issues held a press conference. They blasted Republicans for the lack of action on allowing abortions to protect the health of the mother, and Republicans who were working on the issue were kind of just like, fed up and insulted by that. Like you mentioned, this is a particularly interesting issue because among Republicans, you have this kind of minority split according to national polls. The vast majority, like IVF, they want to protect IVF, but there are some who do consider each embryo to be a human life. So if a freezer malfunctions and embryos are lost, would the clinic be criminally liable for murder? You have the couples who have successfully had a child or two or more and don't want to use their remaining embryos. What do you do with them then? Or couples who maybe ran out of money to pay for these attempts because it's not cheap at all. So those are considerations that are kind of being kicked around right now. But I haven't seen any sort of definitive legislation in the works, though I would imagine something's coming.
So we've been talking about the top issues. So Jimmy, let's now focus on school choice. It made a lot of buzz last year, as you mentioned in our last segment, but it failed to pass in any form last session. I am assuming it's going to make a comeback this year. In fact, didn't Mike Moyle say that this will be one of his top issues?
Yes, and he said that for a while. Not to mention, it's the top issue for several different legislators in both the House and Senate. It's going to come back. We just don't necessarily know what form it's going to take. Like you mentioned, there have been several ideas thrown around over the past few years. You've got proposals that would have created these what they're calling education savings accounts. Essentially, state money would be put into an account that parents could use for private school tuition, tutoring, any kind of education materials that would sort of supplement their studying, things of that nature. You had this tax credit idea kicking around where families would have been reimbursed for tuition expenses up to a certain dollar amount. And of course, the classic idea that's kind of fallen out of favor is just a straight transfer of funds that is paid to public schools per pupil that would then instead go to a private school. So, those are all up in the air. I can't imagine that there won't be any sort of shortage of proposals that will come out, because everyone seems to have a different way of trying to tackle it and thread the needle to get enough approval for it.
But bottom line is this, Jimmy. It is basically whatever you want to call it, whatever it looks like, it is using state money to pay potentially for private education.
Correct. And, the state has, part of its constitution says that should not be the case, and that is outlawed and explicitly forbidden. It's something that, the people who are pushing these school choice options have tried to repeal several times. Something that they keep saying is this so-called Blaine Amendment, which is named after this guy from the 1800s who sort of popularized the idea in putting it into state constitutions in the West. Said that it's unconstitutional, and that's not necessarily the case. The big thing is that the Supreme Court rulings, specifically out of Montana, say that if the state does offer to somehow subsidize private school tuition with public funds, they cannot discriminate based on a school's religious leanings. So Idaho currently does not give out private school tuition subsidies for public school students or potential former public school students. So that wouldn't necessarily apply. But that's another step that they would have to take to at least seemingly meet that constitutional Supreme Court benchmark.
But on the flip side of that, Jimmy, doesn't it say in Idaho state constitution that you must provide free public education?
Yeah, I think the actual language is something thorough and uniform public education system, if I remember correctly. Yes, so that's certainly part of it. And part of the argument from opponents is that by taking this money out of the public school system, you're essentially draining the resources that public schools have to provide that sort of adequate education for the rest of society that doesn't want to send or can't send their children to private school.
So what are some of the other top issues that you think lawmakers might tackle this session? What about something like a grocery tax repeal? Any chance that that might actually happen this year, which would benefit a lot of people?
I wish I knew. It's something
Right.
it's something that Speaker Moyle has been on record multiple times talking about how he's not necessarily against it, but it's a matter of penciling out the numbers because they would have to essentially make up that tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars to pay for the backlog, or not the backlog, but the deficit that would be created by repealing that tax. So, it's got such an odd pairing of lawmakers who support repealing it, and they don't really fall along ideological lines. You have a lot of Democrats who want to repeal it. It's just one of those very complicated issues that may or may not happen, but it's certainly being pushed.
Okay, so speaking of repealing things, any chance about repealing Medicare expansion? Because again, this is something we've heard about ever since Medicare expansion went into effect.
Yeah, Medicaid expansion repeal is certainly on the table for sure. Because if you look at, like we talked about earlier, Democrats being taken off the health and welfare committees in both the House and Senate, there's a vote that is, pretty much a lock to block any sort of repeal attempt in those committees. Again, just a brief explanation. This is something that Idaho voters passed by more than 60% through a ballot measure in 2018 to implement it. The people who are qualified to enroll in Medicaid expansion are those who make too little money to qualify for a federal subsidy on the state health insurance exchange, but too much to qualify for traditional Medicaid. You've got about 81,000 people enrolled as of mid-November. And if you just look at the numbers, the state budgeted $82.2 million for Medicaid expansion in the current fiscal year from the general fund budget. That is 9% of the total state share across all Medicaid plans. So this is probably the best opportunity that Republicans have had recently to repeal this. You've also got these committees not only losing a Democrat, but have turned more conservative than 2 years ago when the committees were last changed.
Okay, so we heard a lot about libraries in the last legislative session and what lawmakers think should be in libraries or not be in libraries. So here's another topic that you had on your list, Jimmy, and this is Bibles in schools. Is this something lawmakers are trying to push as well?
It's something that we've seen from a particularly, I guess, influential lobbying group called the Idaho Family Policy Center. And, it's funny you mentioned libraries. They're the ones who were behind the library bills. They're the ones who have been behind all of the recent abortion legislation going back, 4, 6, 8 years in Idaho. Not to mention the anti-transgender legislation, anti-drag show proposals, all kinds of stuff. So as far as I know, none of us have seen a draft version of this bill, but it's something that the Policy Center had been floating out there in their email newsletters, asking people to sign a petition to bring this back. Essentially, they say they want public schools to recite Bible verses to students each day without commentary. The Idaho Family Policy Center told Idaho Ed News that parents would be able to opt their children out of the daily prayer, but didn't, give them a draft of the legislation just to see how everything would necessarily work. They also told Idaho Ed News that declined to say whether there was a legislator willing to sponsor it. So I don't doubt that there would be at least one legislator willing to sponsor it, but whether or not it would actually get a hearing in a committee is another matter entirely. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't necessarily count it out since they have a pretty good track record of getting bills passed.
So I'm no attorney, Jimmy, but I would think that if something like this passed, this is ripe for a lawsuit, because are you going to recite the Quran every day? I mean, there are, we don't even have to discuss the fact of separation of church and state when it comes to public schools. But if you decide to bring religion into it, there are other religions besides Christianity.
Yeah. And I think maybe that's partially what the Idaho Family Policy Center might be thinking, is getting this to the U.S. Supreme Court, since the court itself in 1962 outlawed publicly backed prayer in schools because of the separation of church and state. And so, specifically in their writings and emails and articles on their website, they talk about how in their view, thankfully, the U.S. Supreme Court is going back to a more originalist constitutional interpretation, and that this issue might be something that they're willing to revisit, like they did with Roe v. Wade.
So, Jimmy, what's next on the legislative schedule? Because my understanding is that the Idaho Press Club legislative preview was set for tomorrow, so Friday morning. What happens there?
Yes, so we'll get a little bit of a taste of the governor's priorities for this next year, as well as those in legislative leadership from both parties. Both are on the record conversations. They're going to take questions from reporters for about an hour each. And if people just can't wait until Monday, you need your legislative fix for whatever reason, you can stream the event at Idaho in Session, or there will be plenty of reporters there to write up or broadcast recaps of it on your chosen media outlet.
And then on Monday is the State of the State. This, of course, will bring live to folks on Boise State Public Radio. But Jimmy, isn't this when Governor Little actually sets his priorities for the new year, when we find out what he wants done?
Yep, we're going to get a broad outline of what he wants to do this upcoming year. A lot of it, if you read those speeches, takes a victory lap for whatever he believes his biggest accomplishments were over the past years. Couple details here and there about the future. But the real meat of it is going to be when his office releases his proposed budget. So then we get an idea of just how much money he's willing to put behind his ideas. We do know that his administration told state agencies to limit ongoing general fund budget increases to no more than 3%. That doesn't count any sort of federal grants or money the agency itself collects through fees. The legislature largely does follow these recommendations, but they're going to nip and tuck here and there and pass their own personal priorities.
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, Jimmy, you literally spend every day at the State House during the legislative session. So before I let you go today, let's talk a little bit about your Legislative Roundup newsletter, because it comes out every week during the session. What's inside it? What can folks expect?
Yeah, they can expect a recap of the week's top stories, sort of a little bit of analysis on what to expect for the week ahead and what things sort of mean for their daily lives, as well as, a curated list of links from other media outlets. Since I'm just one person, I can't cover it all. And we have, thankfully, several other great reporters in this state working for a bunch of different places. So have their writing as well. Not to mention, I always pick a song of the week that kind of reflects what happened in the legislative session the prior week.
Okay, so how do people find the newsletter, Jimmy? Because they can sign up for it, right? So it goes into their inbox?
Sure can. Yep. So go to boisestatepublicradio.org. There is a tab at the top saying newsletters, and you can sign up for it right there, along with the weekly Boise State Public Radio general newsletter.
Well, you are always a regular contributor here on Idaho Matters, so I know at the session we will be talking with you even more. So get some rest and good luck on Monday.
I'll do my best. Thanks, Gemma.
Thanks, Jimmy. We've been speaking with Boise State Public Radio reporter James Dawson about the 2025 Idaho legislative session. He is also the host of the Legislative Roundup newsletter, which comes out every week during the session. We'll, of course, put a link so you can sign up for the newsletter. We'll do that on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. And, of course, we will be seeing more of Jimmy as the legislature gets underway and we talk more about legislature issues as well as previews. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.